This week on Pocket Pedagogy,
we're going to kick you in the teeth, all right? And when you punch us back, we're going to smile at you. And when you knock us down, we're going to get up. And on the way up, we're going to bite a kneecap off, all right? And we're going to stand up. And then it's going to take 2 more shots to knock us down, all right? And on the way up, we're going to take your other kneecap, and we're going to get up. And then it's going to take 3 shots to get us down. And when we do, we're going to take another hunk out of you. Before long, we're going to be the last one standing, all right? That's going to be...
So before we begin, I just want to say I had a completely different intro planned up until about 7 p.m. Central or so on Sunday, January 28th. As a Detroit Lions fan, I was watching the NFC Championship, I was really happy, feeling euphoria I've never known, and then... Anyway, it's Super Bowl week. Sorry, big game week. Did you know you can't legally use the name Super Bowl unless you pay for the privilege? And given that I'm doing an academic breakdown of Game Boy games, it can be reasonably assumed I do not have the resources to do this. At any rate, this year, we're treated to the big game matchup that nobody outside of 2 specific cities with 2 specific fan bases in 2 specific states asked for. So instead today, let's focus more on the idea of football rather than the sad reality. While the contemporary football game landscape really kind of begins and ends with EA's Madden franchise as the only game in town, the field was a lot more competitive back in the Game Boy era. Entries from the Tecmo Bowl, Madden, and NFL Blitz franchises all made their way to different iterations of the platform, alongside shorter-lived and lesser-known franchises like NFL Quarterback Club and Konami's NFL Football. The Game Boy Advance even played host to a Disney sports football game, which honestly is probably the best of all of them. Donald Duck's team is called the Sea Ducks. It's cute. One thing these games all have in common is a bit of a struggle to properly map the action and scale of a game of football to a handheld platform that really can't quite handle the fidelity that those who are looking to play a football simulation require. So you often end up with a minimalist attempt at maximal representation, or awkward attempts at creating pseudo 3D polygonal environments that are, technically impressive given the hardware, but not really very much fun to play. Somewhere in between is Nintendo's Play Action Football, a game that is far from a complex or photorealistic attempt at recreating the gridiron on the Game Boy, but also one that plays to the strengths of that early hardware, with easy-to-follow action and simple, if somewhat flawed, controls. It's the subject of this week's big game edition of Pocket Pedagogy. While it's fallen by the wayside, Play-Action Football was, for a time, Nintendo's attempt at their own football franchise, spanning 3 hardware iterations and remaining exclusive to North America in all of them in a very unusual move for Nintendo. The first, NES Play-Action Football, appeared in 1990. The third, Super Play-Action Football, dropped in the second year of the Super NES's lifespan in 1992. It's the second one that we're interested in today, Play Action Football for the Game Boy. Now, this is a port of the NES game that released about 2 months or so after that game, give or take the sort of strange release calendars of that particular time period. Now, all of these games were developed by TOSE, a longtime development house based out of Kyoto, Japan. Now, longtime retro heads probably already know this, but TOSE is a bit special because it's what's known as a ghost developer, a company that really specifically does not take credit for its work in the finished products. TOSE has been prolific since its 1979 founding, having contributed to or outright developed at least over 1,100 games across countless platforms, from the arcades to mini-computers like the Japanese MSX to mobile phones and the Nintendo Switch. They may be the single biggest developer in the games industry, and certainly one of the most mysterious. That air of mystery does add something to the otherwise very straightforward play-action football, which, as a port of its NES cousin, naturally has to strip back some of the more powerful platform's features. While neither game has the official NFL license, opting instead for generic city names and original logos, the rosters on the NES game were actually accurate thanks to a deal with the NFL Players Association. The Game Boy port does not bother with rosters at all. The 8 teams are distinguished from each other primarily by the plays they have available. Each team only has a handful, but each playbook is different. It's less clear if the teams have specific areas of specialty, like deeper receiving core, stronger defense, better running games, but the simplicity works well enough for the limited hardware. Visually, it also eschews the isometric perspective and bigger character sprites of the NES game for a simpler overhead perspective. The visuals are extremely primitive, but that monochrome pixel art has a certain degree of charm, especially if you can play it on the sharper screen of the analog Pocket, where it actually pops really well and plays nicely with its filters. In a nice touch, special full-screen animations play out for certain field events like touchdowns, field goals, and my personal favorite, when the line crew brings out the chains to see if you got a first down. The move from the isometric view of the NES game to a top-down one does pose issues for deep passes because it takes away a lot of the screen's real estate. The Game Boy game solves this by zooming out from the action when you drop back far enough, replacing the already simple character sprites with simple dots that you see from a sky-high perspective. It's disorienting at first, and honestly never really stops being disorienting, but it's a reasonable enough solution given the lack of screen space. The music and sound in the game is fairly limited. With only a handful of tracks, you're going to be hearing a lot. The quarterback's cadence is represented by some beeps, there's some simulated crowd noise, and there's a handful of audio samples for things like first down and touchdown, though they sound pretty similar. All told, it's semi-ambitious, certainly not bad for an early Game Boy game, but not as good as what the system would be capable of later. From a gameplay standpoint, things do get a little bit hairier. Everything is built around the limited controls of the Game Boy. This is a common theme in a lot of these games. You only have 2 buttons and directional pads, so you have to kind of make do with what you've got. You select plays from a limited menu using the A button to flip pages and the directional and other buttons to select a play. Now, I'm nowhere near enough of a student of football to know when to use a shotgun, when to use an I formation, apart from, just vibes. And the game doesn't really tell you a lot about the other team's personnel to give you a hint either. Still, it works well enough for the hardware. That said, the experience on the different sides of the ball does sort of feel different. So let's start on offense. While later football games would assign face buttons to receivers on offense, play-action football, and other games of its era instead use directional buttons and a pass button. So you push in the direction of the intended receiver and hit the pass button. The QB throws the ball at a length based on the play. You take control of the closest receiver to the ball, who needs to be near the actual pass arrow on the field to catch it. But it's not always clear where that pass arrow will be until about midway through the pass's arc, meaning that it's very easy to end up overshooting or completely missing a receiver. Now, assigning a specific button to a particular receiver wasn't really feasible given the system's limited buttons. But this workaround is more frustrating than understandable and results in the CPU making more passes than I do, even passes that don't seem like they should have actually been possible. Not that we ever see that in the actual NFL. This somewhat erratic system means that when I was playing, I wound up missing the vast majority of my passes for quite a while, which effectively cut off half the offensive playbook. That said, I did start to eventually consistently catch passes more often the more I played the game, but even then, running the ball felt like a safer and more intuitive option for the most part. The game does give you some options on that front, like hitting A for brief bursts of speed or B to dive for an extra yard or two, but there's no indicator or meter suggesting how many you have used or if you can continue using them. Defense is thankfully simpler. You choose the play and then simply move your defenders to try to stop the other team. Generally, I find offense easier than defense when playing football sims, but that's not really the case here, and it has a lot to do with the way the game is designed for the platform. All that said, as someone who loves blitzing even when it doesn't make sense, I like that the game does seem to reward a more smash-mouth style of play. Blitzes tend to work extremely well against the CPU. Special teams are also pretty simple. You stop an arrow to set the direction and fill the meter to set power on your kicks for field goals and punts. Simple, but it works. even though field goals can be a little bit tricky to aim if you can't see the goalpost, which you usually can't until you're pretty close to the end zone. Gameplay options are fairly simple. You can play against 4 different difficulty levels of CPU team, play a playoff tournament to get to the Super Bowl, or play one-on-one against another player using the link cable. You can also use the link cable to cooperate with another player to take on the CPU. I wasn't able to test any of that out, but the tournament mode is interesting because it uses passwords to save progress, meaning if you really want to advance ahead and get to the Super Bowl, you can just look some up online. All told, play-action football is not a sprawling package, but it does what it needs to do: emulate a basic game of football on underpowered dot matrix display hardware in 1990. So what can we learn from it in 2024? In playing this game, I found myself thinking about football and the 23-24 Detroit Lions. I mean, I've been thinking about them a lot lately for some reason. If the 23-24 Lions are anything, they are not a team of marquee superstars. They are rarely overwhelming favorites despite their success. What they are is a team of talented players honed to play the game within the framework of a culture and leadership that plays to their strengths rather than trying to force them to be something they aren't. The result? A team that punched well above its weight and came just 1 win away from going to the Super Bowl for the first time in franchise history. The Detroit Lions' success, both now and success to come, lies in adapting to who their players are and playing to the team's core strengths, which is something play-action football also does. Like the Lions' secondary, play-action football has its quirks and its flaws, but like the rest of the team, it's good enough at what it does do well that it's worth paying attention to. Arguably, it's actually a more satisfying game of football on the platform than most that came before and after. So what can we learn from a game design standpoint? It is fun to try to push hardware to do surprising things, and we're certainly going to see examples of that coming up right here on Pocket Pedagogy. But it's important to recognize that sometimes that ambition can come at the cost of actual gameplay, especially early on in a platform's life cycle when developers are trying to figure it out. Where most other tries at American football on the Game Boy strive for authentic realism that sometimes showed the limits of the system's capabilities, the developers at TOSE instead opted for the idea of football, offering a strict, no-frills version of the game that would serve its purpose for the intended audience. Now, make no mistake, play-action football is not a revolutionary game. And it's not one that we owe the present day of virtual football to. But it is a game that worked within the parameters of its time to make a functional and enjoyable, if somewhat flawed, experience. It may not have enjoyed the Detroit Lions level of success, but it has the spirit. And by golly, that's enough for me. I'm Brian Carr, and we'll see you next time on Pocket Pedagogy. Next time on Pocket Pedagogy, what can a poor boy do, except to appear as a handheld game? Because in sleepy Game Boy Town, well, that's just the place for a street-fighting man.